Goeienaand. Welcome. My name is Federico Freschi. I'm the Executive Dean here at the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture. And it's my very great pleasure and privilege, tinged with a lot of sadness, to welcome you all here this evening. And also my great pleasure to welcome Mark, who's been such an important part of the GSA for the past 5 years. And this, of course, is his valedictory lecture. He's saying goodbye to us. And Mark, as I've been greeting friends and colleagues outside, everybody's saying the same thing, which is no. No. We can't believe this moment has come. It's really, it's quite hard to process the idea of the GSA without Mark. And if you look around at all the colleagues and students and friends in the room, I think it's a testimony to the impact that you've had here and how you're going to be missed. So Mark concludes his tenure here as the director of the GSA after 5 years. And as I'm sure all of you know by now, the GSA is the largest postgrad professional architecture program in the country. And during his time here, Mark has guided the school with vision and purpose, which I think are two words that very aptly describe him, vision and purpose. Mark has deepened the founding ethos of the school, the ethos of transformative pedagogies, into a broader commitment to transformative practices. And it's really been interesting to see that shift over the past 5 years. Under his leadership, the GSA has reimagined architectural education to really centre equity, criticality, and relevance, while also actively addressing the urgencies of race, gender, and class within the South African built environment. Mark is an architect and an educator with over 30 years of international experience across the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, and the United States, bringing together architectural practice with academic and institutional leadership. He studied at the Architectural Association in London, so he has a deep first-hand experience of the unit system, which he brought to bear here, and later completed a PhD in architecture and design at RMIT in Melbourne through the Barcelona campus, with a focus on reflective practice and interdisciplinarity. Alongside his academic work, he has maintained a long-standing architectural practice based in the Caribbean, contributing to national planning and urban development strategies and across the region. He has served in leadership roles in several professional bodies, including as president of the Trinidad and Tobago Institute of Architects, the Commonwealth Association of Architects, and vice president of the Federation of Caribbean Associations of Architects. He has held academic appointments and lectured at institutions including Yale, Cornell, UIUC, the University of the West Indies, and the Caribbean School of Architecture. In 2021, he was honored as Plum Distinguished Professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and his design studio, Analog, was featured in the university's exhibition at the 2023 Venice Biennale. Throughout his career, he has championed the idea that architecture is not only a technical discipline, but a social practice, a way of advancing human experience, asking difficult questions, and imagining more just futures. So, as he now is about to leave the GSA, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the remarkable contribution that he's made to the school and to our wider architectural community. Many of you in the room this evening would, I think, agree with me when I say that his calm, focused, and unflappable leadership has been a source of immense stability through times of challenge and change over the past 5 years. He stepped into the school at a moment when, it was not only COVID, but there was also a lot of disruption within the faculty. And somehow pulled it all together and moved it into this building and held the unit system together and brought a team together and made it all work in a way that made it seem effortless, but I know it took immense effort and commitment. So with quiet determination and generous mentorship, he's led the school through a successful SACP accreditation, expanded the unit system, and initiated the development of a practice-based PhD, laying the foundation for the next generation of architectural scholarship and practice in South Africa. Equally extraordinary, and the presence of everyone in the room this evening attests to this, has been his gift for building relationships across disciplines, across continents, across communities. His deep commitment to collaboration and his truly unparalleled skill as a networker and advocate have significantly elevated the GSA's national and international profile. He leaves behind not only an institution that is stronger and more focused, but also a wide network of colleagues, students, and friends who have been shaped by his clarity, his warmth, and his vision. So Mark, personally, I thank you. I think everyone in this room thanks you. I thank you personally as a friend, I hope, and your boss. but also on behalf of the faculty and the GSA for your invaluable leadership. We wish you every success in your new role at Iowa State University. Their gain is our devastating loss. But we appreciate, we'll always immensely value what you brought to us. So we wish you well. And we look forward to this lecture, aptly entitled Coda. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, hope you can all hear me. Thank you so much for coming. Nice turnout. I was sharing earlier that I was, Denise called me earlier and said, the list is quite long. We might need a breakout room. And when I looked at the list, I saw there were quite a lot of names from Trinidad. And I recognize it on social media. This has been seen by friends in Trinidad. And I know it's being recorded, so I want to thank them for putting their names down. And you may not be here in person, but you're here in spirit, a long way away. Had some anxiety about this. It's it's sad for me this time, and it's a sad moment emotionally, but also I think an important moment, an important time to kind of close something, to finish something, and to bring it to a close gracefully and with intention and with purpose. So, thank you so much for coming today to share that and to listen to what I have to say. There are moments in preparing for this where I felt, this feels like a, Elton John's tribute, or the sort of grand finale, which I don't want it to be. So I don't want to think of it as some sort of spectacle. When I started here, it was in the middle of COVID, and it's normal practice in many academic institutions for when when an academic arrives in an institution, for them to give a presentation, for them to give a talk, to present their credentials. But that wasn't possible when I arrived because the whole world was in turmoil, everything was done online. It just wasn't possible. And I kept thinking, well, I'll do it when things quieten down, and it just never happened. So in a way, this is a kind of retrospective inaugural lecture. So that's how I've tried to frame it, and I tried to think about what I could share, what I would like to share. I'd felt coming into the school that because of the diverse nature of the unit system, because of the diversity that was required, it was important to really focus on the students and focus on kind of reinforcing, trying to kind of stabilize that system. So I didn't want my work or my research or my practice to be some sort of talisman or motif for the sort of work that I expected the school to do. I very much felt that I was coming into the position as an educator, one educated and with an architectural formation, but not somebody that was arriving with the intention of wanting to kind of create a house style or a particular approach. It's not what the unit system is about. The unit system is about diversity. And also, I also wanted to manage and negotiate my own engagement with this idea of transformation and how I might approach that. I think before I moved here, I'd been involved with the school. Leslie Locko, who you know, founded the school, founded the ethos of the school, I'd met Leslie, and Leslie had invited me here. I'd visited a couple of times and was completely enchanted with the school and completely and very curious about this idea of transformation. I'm from Trinidad. Trinidad has an equally diverse, ethnically diverse, and equally complex history with different nuances. So I was really curious about how architecture existed in a place like that and how forms of education, or a form of education that seemed to have been so ingeniously conceived, could serve that context, could work within that context. I was curious about it. And I spoke to many people before coming, and during COVID there was lots of time to read and to go online and to explore things. And I began reading texts about transformation in education, trying to understand South Africa, trying to understand what it was about. I was reading Nadine Gordimer, Jem Coetzee, and I was trying to get my head into the space. One of the most powerful things that I found, the most powerful kind of ciphers or ways of understanding it, was through photography. And I'm going to speak a little bit about photography and the idea of images this evening. And it was really through the work of David Goldblatt and Santa Mofokeng that I was able to kind of, in a way, build a picture for myself, build a kind of an idea or a kind of sensibility around some of the issues that I was going to confront. So when I came, I felt kind of prepared in a way. And 5 years later, I think that those early lessons have proven to be very useful. This has just gone off. Yeah. Can you hear me?
They just done. Yeah.
I thought it had gone off. Can you hear me now?
So we're just increasing the volume to the other side. We're just increasing the volume to the other side of the room.
Okay, so
Just one second.
should I speak louder or just keep going? That's still on, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds a bit better. Yeah. That sounds much too loud now. Okay. Well, I'm just going to keep talking. Yeah. So this evening, what I thought I would do is, as I said, do my kind of retrospective inaugural. But I thought I would share with you a bit about my practice as an architect and some of the things I've been involved with, and to talk you through some of the work that I've done, and importantly, share with you some of the work that I did in the research I did during the course of my PhD, which was a practice-based PhD and a very transformative moment for me professionally. I think it's relevant and important to understand this idea of reflection in practice. I'm going to share with you some thoughts about that and how those learnings, how those ideas have informed the arc of my own practice and my own career. And then talk a little bit about how that might feed, or how I've tried to work that into the teaching practice. And just as a kind of preamble, trying to put all this together has been quite complicated. So I'm hoping it makes some sort of clarity. I always like this quote from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which speaks to when you suddenly try and pull things together, you realize how little you actually know. And that's how I feel. But it's still important to articulate and share what we're thinking, what we're doing. Are you giving me secret signals? No, it's not. I was getting some secret techie signals. But before I kind of delve into the lecture, I'm going to share something with you. When I was, after I studied in London, I worked for some practices. I worked for Norman Foster. I worked for Ulrika Brandy in Hamburg. I had some really lovely experience working in Europe. And importantly, I worked for a very important architect called Frank Duffy. And when I was working with him, he happened to be the president of the Royal Institute of British Architects. And up until that point, that was an institution that I held in utter contempt and didn't like the idea of institutions, I suppose appropriately for somebody in their 20s. But working with him and understanding his way of processing his practice was really fascinating because he was driven by research. He had a PhD, which was unusual for an architect, at least the architects that I knew. And the practice was built around this idea of research. And for me, research was what happened in libraries. So seeing him implement ideas around research and practice was really fascinating. And during that period, he was working on a document called A Strategic Survey of the Profession, which was a complete review of architectural practice in the UK. And I worked alongside him on that, which is an enormous privilege. at that moment. And when I told him I was going back to Trinidad to set up my own practice, we went out for a drink, and he shared this with me. This is my drawing, not his. It's not working. Still do it manually. He shared this graph with me, and he said, this is every project ever. Whether it's an architectural project or a film, and I've shared this with some of you, it's every project ever. And it speaks to expectations that people have at the beginning of a project. The idea that you're building your house, and what you would really like is a, 15-room villa with a Fred and Ginger staircase, a swimming pool, a recording studio, the works. But you know that your budget is not that of Beyonce or people who have properties like that. So most people begin projects with a kind of managed expectation. And over time, and this is now we're moving to the architectural sphere, the work with the architect starts. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of enjoyment looking at materials and possibilities. And then the design is complete and everybody's really excited about it, really happy and looking forward to the building being built and their dreams being materialized. Their expectations are now far in excess of where they started. And then the budget estimates come in. And then the contractor's quotes come in. And then the building goes on site. Terrible conditions are encountered that were unforeseen on the site. The contractor goes bankrupt, has to be changed. All the things you wanted are kind of made suddenly more expensive by some global turmoil that has impacted the rate of exchange. Then COVID happens, the project stops, but eventually the building starts taking shape, it gets painted, the bills are paid, and you move in. And Frank said, this is the job of an architect. Architects manage people through that process in the case of building. As I said, you can apply this to anything. I'm sure those of you who are not architects can relate to this in various ways. And he says the misnomer is that that's where architecture happens. Now that's where the kind of the good bits happen in a way. That's where the kind of the visible bits happen. That's where people think that it happens, but it's actually this. It's actually the whole process. That's what a project is. And Frank said, as an architect, the fact that you repeat that over and over again constitutes practice. It constitutes iterative practice. It constitutes you repeatedly performing something so that each time you do it, you learn from it and you carry it on to the next project. So that's what practice is. That's how I've always held and understood the idea of practice. Doing something repeatedly, doing something iteratively, and importantly, reflecting on it and learning from it. And sure, clients might focus on that part, magazines might focus on that part, but any practicing architect here will know that that is what a project is like. And they're not all like that. Some of them never come back up. Some of them soar, but as a kind of schema, it's the life of a kind of project. So I just wanted to share this as a kind of really valuable piece of learning that Frank Duffy shared with me. And another quote from a friend of mine, David Scott, who speaks about projects always being in progress. They're never really finished. They never really fully form themselves. So there's also the complexity of continuing to do work, the continuous process of production that I think is really important. So that's why I've called this, well, coda is obvious. It's the ending. It's an end phase. But the idea of the practice itself as a project, practice as a project, that's how I look at what I do. I don't look at what I do as a job. I have little projects on in Trinidad. I do the work here. I do many different things, and all of those things constitute my practice. This is part of my practice. So in an educational context, I'm really eager for students to understand that they may not be registered with SACAP, they may not have finished their qualification, but they have a practice, they have nascent practices. And it's important that we understand that every piece of work we do in that constitute is a contribution to our bigger practice. And it's perhaps a nice way of holding some of the thinking that I'd like to share with you in the lecture this evening. It's a kind of preamble to... So I'm going to share with you some personal stuff. When I was a student, we'd subscribe to architectural magazines, and I remember Domus, which is a very sort of flashy Italian magazine. When I say subscribe, the library would subscribe, and we would go and look at them in the library because they were too expensive. But I was always really fascinated by the biographies of the architects or the practitioners at the end. I was always really curious about where did they study. I was curious about how old they were, what sort of things they'd done, where they worked. So to me, the kind of biographic dimension of the work of architects or any cultural practitioner can be really important and instructive in understanding. So I'm going to share a bit about my own formation. I'm going to talk about images, how images are important to me, and why they're important to me, the idea of the image, buildings. I'm going to share some buildings with you that I've produced. And I'm going to talk about the idea of translation and the idea of process. Something that I benefited from when I did my PhD was at the beginning of that process in the pre-application. Gabi Seifert, who's a professor in Innsbruck in Austria, was saying, what are you about? What are you interested in? What are you trying to do with your practice? And I'd never thought about that. I'd never thought about having to answer that question. What was my position, or what was my aim or aspiration? And I said, I think I'm interested in a kind of clarity, that somehow the production of architecture can be a clarifying process. And I wasn't quite sure what I meant by that, but I showed examples of architecture that appeared to be really clear, really explicit, in different ways. And she said, that's about a process. Clarity emerges from a process of cultural and creative production. And that's the work that I did during my PhD, was reflecting on that process in my own practice to see how that worked, to kind of analyze it and understand it, reflect upon it, to kind of understand the logic in my own practice. And that's embodied in the idea of translation. And then finally, I want to talk about how I've endeavored to kind of channel that into the work of this wonderful school and this idea of transformation and how pedagogy can be transformative. And in this case, we're in an architecture school. So how does that transformative pedagogy, that beautiful idea, how can that be translated into practices? How can it be manifest? What are the spatial or material consequences of transformative education in architecture? What does that look like? Who are the transformative practitioners? That fascinates me. In a world that is contested and complicated and confusing, how can we define or understand or start to put in place what are transformative practices? So formation. I spent my early years growing up between Trinidad in the Caribbean and London. My mother's from London, my father's from Trinidad. And my sister and I spent quite a lot of time hovering between them. That's me with my big head, leaning on my lovely father, at a beach in the south of Trinidad. And those are where my first memories are, in that place. Warm place, ventilated blockworks, interesting tropical architecture. My father was a surveyor. He was a government land surveyor. And I was really proud of his work. And he would take me sometimes, getting up really early in the morning, getting into a jeep with the surveying crew, and driving for a couple of hours to a remote part of Trinidad, or sometimes to other islands, to survey land. And something really interesting that he did, I knew what he did was to do with the theodolite and measurement and these other guys. I couldn't figure that out at that age. But I remember something that he would do whenever we were approaching the piece of land. And at that time, there were a lot of sugar plantations, cocoa estates, coffee plantations that were being sold by the descendants of plantation owners after independence. They were being sold to the government, so they had to be surveyed. And my father would always stop at little parlors that you sometimes see on this roadside of the road in Trinidad. He would get out, he smoked, he'd light up a cigarette, and he'd speak to somebody there. He'd sit down with them and engage with them. And for me, that felt, why are we not going to the site? Why did we just get to the site? But I realized it was him undertaking his survey, not the measurement, not the evaluation or the articulation of the survey through drawings, but understanding the place, understanding the stories that might inform that place. And very often it would surface or reveal a lot of very valuable information or knowledge about the site that couldn't be gleaned in any other way. And importantly, I think he was also trying to teach me. He's trying to show me how to be in the world. And I think he did a really conscientious job at that. And I saw him working with other younger surveyors and bringing them up. And I admired that and I aspired to that. And it's work that I aspire to do with my work as an educator. So he spent much of his life surveying Trinidad. He knew it like the back of his hand. He would always know where north was. He would always know what time of day it was without looking at his watch, because he was so attuned to the geography, to the meteorology, the position of the sun. And he grew up in Port of Spain, Trinidad, a colonial city, a city with a lot of complexity, but also a lot of richness, a lot of rich, diverse culture that manifested itself in many ways that we all receive in our occupations of cities. And in a really extraordinary landscape, a really beautiful, compelling, lush, saturated, wonderful landscape with a complex history, a complex colonial history built around exploitation of enslaved people, but from which a culture had emerged, a very specific and particular culture. My mother, like my father, the first person to be educated at a university level in her family. My mother is an engineer and a physicist. I'm hoping she doesn't call me in the middle of this. She's 92. And I often have presentations and, mum comes up, but Boitumela helped me disable that momentarily. But that's my mum, Ruth, in Trinidad in the 1960s. And she's wearing a lovely dress that she made. And she used to go to town with me on Saturday mornings and she would buy fabric. And she'd buy enough fabric to make my sister a little dress and me a little suit out of the same fabric. She used to like making things. As many of you know, she was a rocket scientist. She was she was a part of a team that designed the first computer-guided missile system. Not something she is now proud of, but something that seemed really important at the time, the Blue Streak missile. And she came from a post-war London. She'd spent some of the time growing up in the landscape during the war where children were evacuated. So another set of landscapes that I was fortunate enough to be exposed to and that constituted part of my own formation. And reflecting on the work that I've done, I can feel intuitively so much that has come from them and from that. And I think possibly with all of us. Our parents form us in different ways, and our experiences inform us in different nuanced ways, which contributes to the richness of practice and the projects we do and the way that we work. I studied at the Architectural Association. These are some student drawings I did. I worked in Peter Salter's unit. I know Engelan, colleague, also studied with Peter Salter in London, an extraordinary architect who encouraged us to try to see the world with great acuity, to try to understand and decipher what we saw with a kind of clarity, not with a willfulness that kind of dominated a lot of the architecture that prevailed at the time. These were drawings that were undertaken in Inisheer in the west coast of Ireland. And after completing the Architectural Association, I worked in the Norman Foster's office in London by the Thames, which was a fascinating experience, working on a variety of projects in Nîmes, in London, as a junior, but sometimes working alongside a very great architect and a very great team of architects, and seeing a kind of level of optimized production, high-tech optimized production, kind of a sort of haute couture, haute cuisine of haute architecture, high-level production of architecture, very expensive, very intense, very competitive, and producing beautiful, beautiful objects. Then I worked with Ulrika Brandy in Hamburg. I spent 2 years working on this project, the Galerie de l'Evolution in Paris, which was a restoration and a renovation of the old Musée de Zoologie and the Jardin des Plantes. We worked on the interior fit out of this. And then working for Frank Duffy and DGW, working on urban planning projects in East Germany. So I had a really rich experience, always with the intention of at some point returning to Trinidad. And when I got back to Trinidad, I was fortunate to work with a really extraordinary architect, Colin Laird. He was the architect of this building. This drawing is from 1956. And I can tell you, in terms of architectural style, a lot of buildings look like that, not that scale, but they were colonial architectural structures. And Colin was part of a generation of architects who were consumed by modernism and the idea of modernity. And this was a competition entry for the Queen's Hall that was actually subsequently built. And I was able to work with Colin. When I got back, he asked me to assist him in submitting a proposal for the National Library, which was at that point a competition. And I joined with him on that project. And he won it. And he said, let's discuss how we're going to engage you. So I'm really hopeful, thinking he's going to offer me a job. And he said, I'm not going to offer you a job. I want you to set up your own practice. I will pay you a monthly stipend to help me with this project. You can support me, but you set up your own practice while you're doing it, which was extraordinarily generous. Colin did a lot of his own work and drawings, so much of the work on this project, he was producing the work with a small team of people. And what he did was, every time he was asked to do another smaller project, he would give it to me. He would give me the project. And I was able to rely on him for advice and judgment, but it allowed me to build my own practice. I thought it was an act of extraordinary generosity, but also an example of professionalism, of bringing people up. And at the end of 4 years, this project was finished, and we decided our business was finished together on that basis. And I said, Colin, I don't know how to thank you. And he said, that's easy. He said, whenever you're in a position to do what I did for you, pass it on. It's an important lesson for me, and I would not have been able to establish my practice without that support from him, and an act of generosity that allowed me to develop my own trajectory. So at that time, I'm in Trinidad, I'm in my early 30s, and I want to be the Norman Foster of Trinidad, the Norman Foster of the Caribbean. And I start realizing that that's not going to be possible for a number of reasons, talent aside, but because the conditions of architectural production in Trinidad are very different from Europe. And I found that out on building sites. I found out that I could complete a sort of huge set of production drawings, take them to a site, and they would be substantially and effectively ignored. That the instructions that took place on site were often verbal or gestural, or the drawings were an indication of intent. So it was a complete relearning of my role in relation to the process of production. And it started me thinking and being curious about what other architects were doing in other parts of the Caribbean. I started traveling around whenever I could to different places and being confronted with quite complex scenarios. This is the Cité Soleil, just outside Port-au-Prince in Haiti. It's a very dangerous place. There's a lot of crime and serious issues going on there, and a lot of problematic social and political issues. And I was recognizing that the structure and formation of architectural and urban production was not responding to this. There was no answer, there was no recognition of this as a condition that needed to somehow be addressed. All of this taking place in a fabulous landscape, where tourism, rather than agriculture, was now becoming the mainstay of the economy, and in which lived many people who required purpose, who required space, who required a kind of political life, who required a social life that architecture, through modernism, promised to provide, but clearly was not providing here. And this started to trouble me, this incapacity that I had to reconcile the type of work that I was producing with the complex issues that I was witnessing and observing in the society around me. And I'm going to shift gear now to another dimension, and a way in which I started exploring that and trying to understand the condition, which was through photography and through the production of images. Immediately before studying architecture, I had actually started studying film and photography. And it's a long story, but I shifted to architecture, and I'm glad I did. But I sustained and maintained my photographic practice through the production of images that initially were preoccupied with, in the sense of taking photographs of architectural space, but also became a kind of a tool for research, a tool of research, a way of seeing the world. There's a lovely passage in a text by David Hockney, the British architect, and he speaks about painting and the value of painting. And he speaks about the idea that, we go to the gallery to see the fabulous painting of the Blue Bicycle by a famous artist. But we're not going to that gallery to see the Blue Bicycle. We're going to see how the artist who painted that Blue Bicycle saw that Blue Bicycle. And I began to understand that similarly with photography, it's how we look at the world. The photograph can reveal nuanced ways of seeing the world. And I began to explore that through photography, looking at landscapes, looking at places, looking at architecture, not as scenography, but trying to organize my understanding and framing of it, how the different types of spaces, the different conditions, the different locations, and the different atmospheres that were created by the spaces I was encountering. I became very interested in this idea of atmosphere, the idea that spaces have atmospheres. They can be described technically, they can be described formally, but they all possess atmospheres at very specific moments, in very specific and nuanced ways, over and in time. So this became a kind of overriding preoccupation that in my mind didn't have anything specifically to do with or at least obviously to do with the production of architecture, but somehow seemed related to it. And its work and an interest that began to emerge through the PhD that I did. This idea that we hold repositories of images in our minds. And those images don't need to be visual. Those images can be sonic. They can be sensory. They can be to do with music. They can be to do with movement. Different people, different individuals hold the idea of memory in their minds in different ways. And the expression of those memories, the expression of those ideas, linked with the image, the idea of an image and idea constituting what's called an eidetic image. An image that is conjured in the mind can derive from sound, can derive from painting, it can derive from the visual, it can derive from the haptic. But we build up this sort of repository, a kind of repertoire of ideas or thoughts or experiences that constitute our sensibility, that constitute our way of being in the world. Writers will write about it, painters will paint about it. My kind of thought and thinking behind this was to photograph it, and continues to be. And I'll come back to that idea. Then buildings. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I don't want this to be a focus on these buildings. In my practice, I'm sharing 5 projects here. Responsible for a wide range of projects, planning projects, civic projects, and here there are some houses that I've designed in the past. It's actually my house. And as a project of research whilst doing the PhD, began to try to kind of understand and analyze the houses, analyze the spaces in a way after they had been done, after they had been planned, after they had been processed, understanding them as spaces in time, understanding them as sequences of spaces, as a kind of choreography of space, sometimes driven by a program, sometimes driven by intuitive or spontaneous ideas or notions of what spaces could be or how they could be formulated. Understanding how spaces sit within landscapes, how houses or buildings position themselves, how they're situated in landscapes became really important. What drives those decisions, what drives how buildings sit within landscapes. And looking at examples of how others had situated or sited buildings, the idea of precedence, the idea of learning how to discern and observe how others had done it. Taro Ando, Atelier 7, and trying to learn from those, informing my own approaches and my own way of thinking through how these notions of constellated programs and ideas could be formulated and interpreted and then made manifest in a built form, where the architecture referenced by existing spaces, referenced by things seen in passing, referenced by things studied, could start to create and form its own language, its own structure. A kind of experiment, continuing experiment and kind of game, and then observing how those spaces and those ideas then manifest themselves, how they become real, how they become occupied, how we occupy them. Starting to think of architecture not as a sort of formal object, but a set of experiences, in much the same way that a photograph captures an atmosphere, that architecture could be seen as the choreography of series or sequences or notions or ideas about atmosphere. Not scenography, but atmosphere, lived experience, the idea of this experiencing space. I'm not big on quoting cultural theorists, but Walter Benjamin, in his famous essay on industrialization and media, speaks to architecture being different to the other arts, in that it's an art that is experienced in a state of distraction, which is such a compelling idea. We tend to think of architecture, or we've been programmed in many ways to think of architecture as something that is visual, but actually it's not. It's something that we experience in multiple ways. We touch it, we feel it, we hear it. Yes, sure, we see it, we smell it. Our footfall on the ground on different surfaces, our relationship emotionally and associatively to different materials, all contribute to that experience. And our experience, repeated experience over time in spaces, all contribute to this notion of the architecture being experienced in a state of distraction. So how we choreograph these moments became really very important to me. And trying to extract these moments was some of the work that I did during the PhD by studying specific moments in buildings that were designed and formulated not for scenographic effect, but with a view to conjuring ideas that had qualities of light, qualities of materiality, that responded to sunlight, that responded to different diurnal changes, the different meteorological changes that we experience in the day. Those all became things that I was fascinated with and began exploring with. These are all houses, so I'm sharing specific approaches to houses and how could explore these ideas of how a building situates itself, how it's located in the landscape, how it's formulated as a choreography, as a sequence or suite of movements, not just as a formal construct, but as a set of experiences, as a set of kind of lived haptic experiences that all contribute to the experience of occupying space and time. This became a preoccupation in the research I did for the PhD, and I began reflecting on it, began thinking about the value of this, how it could be applied, how I understood it, and also realized that I was exercising this curiosity, these preoccupations, within a very limited context that was not addressing the concerns that I was beginning to be quite worried about, the social and political and environmental concerns. I was designing beautiful houses for wealthy people, which was gratifying in many ways, but somehow was not attending to some of the more critical issues that I thought that we needed to be facing. And even through making, understanding how to work with people, work through making, through the integration of artifacts and objects within buildings, in this case, halfway through a project, a client flying in a kind of ancient door from some part of Central Europe and wanting it integrated into their house. These are the day-to-day preoccupations, but what did they mean? What was the value? How did they resonate within a broader context of cultural production? So I started thinking about that. I started to think about going what Gabby Seifert said about what's the process here? What are you doing here? And how could that process be applied? How could it be, what do they say in fine art? How could it be scaled up? How could it be scaled in a way that it could be deployed in broader settings or broader contexts? How could it be oriented so that it can satisfy some of those deeper concerns that I was feeling on a kind of level of conscience? So I started looking more carefully at how I was observing things on an urban scale, not just in terms of a detailed application of architectural knowledge, looking at this idea of a kind of provisionality, how we experience architecture, we understand our experience of architecture as being kind of finite or determined by something that's complete, something that's full, but also the delight and the joy and the fascination of seeing things that were not complete, that were not full, the fascination with sites like this is in Seattle, or that fascinating thing that we see occasionally when something's being demolished and a building is exposed. The idea of a kind of provisionality, that architecture, in the same way as we experience it in diversified ways and nuanced ways, the idea that the production of architecture primarily focused on, say, new buildings or new production, it's not meant to be defined by that it could be defined or understood through a series of observations and a series of experiences. And this experiencing of space, this understanding of how we experience it, being something really quite critical to how we might make it. I thought about the idea of rooms, how rooms are formed, how rooms constitute kind of containers of space. And then through my own buildings, how those rooms might be understood to be registers of landscapes, and how that choreography of the interior spaces became a kind of logic or a way of understanding production of architecture that could be translated in many ways. I became fascinated with the capturing of provisional moments, or moments that didn't really capture the building in its complete state, or the process of production in its complete state, but that interrogated how something was happening, how it was happening in time at any given moment. I looked at my father's work, how my father was looking at landscapes, how he was measuring landscapes, how he was trying to register landscape as a surveyor, and how architecture could also register a landscape by situating itself within broader landscape. Architecture could become a register. So it was a sort of deeper conceptual understanding of what the resonance of architecture could be that I would describe as being a kind of sensitizing towards the idea of something being situated, something belonging in a place, something having a deep, resonant fixing or adherence to a place, which spoke to ideas of identity, ideas of belonging, ideas of materiality, how those spoke to those feelings and those sentiments. And looking at how artists go through these processes for different reasons, in different ways. They study the form, the idea of what they're representing, that there's this process that drives how we formulate what we produce. And that became something really important to me. What is that process? What is that process that allows us to enter the world and make things in a responsible way? Looking back to the work that I'd done as a student, this idea of registration and how that could be translated started shifting and changing and becoming more experimental and moving away from a sort of formalized abstraction and resolution. And around that time, which is the time I was doing my PhD, is the moment that I became introduced to this school. And I met Leslie. I was introduced to Leslie in London, and she told me about this school, Transformative Pedagogy, which sounded abstract to me. But the more I learned about it, and on visiting here, recognized that here was an attempt, in a way, to do something along the lines that I was trying to reconcile. How do I use the knowledge that I have? How do I deploy the knowledge I have as an architect, somebody who knows how to make things? How can I deploy that in a setting that is so contested, that is so problematic? In this case, South Africa, but it's the world. How do we deploy that knowledge? How do we engage that knowledge? And this idea of transformative pedagogy seemed to speak to that. It seemed to suggest that there was a way of shifting things, and through learning and through teaching, we could explore that. And on visiting the school, I recognized that what was happening here was something significant. Something really deeply significant that I'd not seen anywhere else. In fact, when I first visited the school, I was really struck by just how engaged students were with the work they were doing, because they were being encouraged to develop a personal relationship to their work, to use their own experience, their own way of looking at the world, to invest that way of looking at the world into the work that they produced. And for a period of time, they could be unconcerned in many ways with whether what was produced corresponded to what everybody expected, but responded to their intention and their desire and their curiosity to address some of the complexities that they were identifying and seeing in the world. It's a tradition, one could argue it's an avant-garde tradition to establish schools like this. The Bauhaus, Mies van der Rohe School in Illinois, the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology that was based on the Architectural Association program in tropical architecture in Ghana. There's a tradition of developing and building pedagogic models. University of Austin in Texas, John Haydock's three-square plan. Here we have the Eames at Ulm, the idea of relating this type of thinking to social programming. There's a tradition, there's a genealogy of schools that at different moments have tried to engage and understand the zeitgeist, the particular moment. All the examples I've shared are all in, with the exception of the Kumasi School, are all European. School I went to, this is Alvin Boyarski's summer school before he took over the presidentship of the Architectural Association, which gave rise to practitioners, which gave space to practitioners such as Archigram, the creation of spaces of learning and exploration that would enrich our own particular nuanced and experiential relationship and engagement with our discipline. You can see a rather youthful-looking Zaha and Mohsin Mustafavi and Rem Koolhaas all participating and in a way emerging from these constellations of pedagogic experimentation. So this is what this school felt like to me. This is Nigel Coates' unit, Carlos Villanueva, doing highly experimental work. And it struck me that what had happened here at a time, a really critical political moment, that it had allowed something to flourish, something to kind of appear in this context, in this society. I think you need to go to the next slide on that side. That allowed an opening up, that had allowed a response to a call, a kind of, there was an answer to the question that hadn't in a way been formed. There was a demand for change, a demand for transformation that coincided with a lot of thinking that was happening globally about rethinking architectural education for all sorts of reasons. This book, anthology edited by Harriet Harris, was looking at radical pedagogies, looking at ways we could rethink architecture to address precisely this idea of reconciliation, of reconciling our social ambitions, our social aspirations, our social desires with the normative tropes and strictures of conventional institutionalized education. So at one time, this project had to happen in an institution, but in another way, it also had to kind of upset that institution. It also had to challenge that institution. These were some of the ideas that I engaged with and was witnessing here and seeing here in this school, driven by Leslie, and many of you who are here today were teaching or students at that time. It was a really exciting moment. Spoke to some of the ideas in Paulo Freire's work, Ivan Illich's work, and some of the more contemporary thinking that was looking at demythologizing architecture, in a way defrocking architecture, saying there are lots of spatial agents in the world, there are lots of people working with space, working with ideas that are not qualified. We shouldn't put this thing on a pedestal, we need to understand how it really actually works. And the school seemed to be a really extraordinary site for that. And I think driven by Leslie's acuity, her vision, and informed by many people I know, but specifically and particularly those that I personally know, Finzi's vision and ideas, and his belief in the idea of mentorship, of education as being a vehicle for transformation through architecture. And then Federico, who championed this through the system. It was a really unusual constellation of energy that informed what the school has become. And this quote that, I'm not going to read it out, you might want to kind of read through it, but it speaks to, so from Achille Mbembe, but it speaks to a kind of broader vision or look at how one might view architecture through education and the idea of the publicness of a university. So a kind of political idea, political and social idea tied to this liberative idea of transformation. So that's what I met. That's what excited me. It seemed to me, here's this place that is speaking to some of the dilemmas and the dichotomies that I feel that I'm confronting in my own practice, that provided a way, a kind of an avenue of generating work of speaking about work, of talking about work. There are some of you in this photograph who are in this room today. This was in 2018. And the idea that there could be a space to discuss those ideas, a space where different voices were welcome, different thinkers, different people operating in the space. And Pomat Sipo, who's out at Bartlett, was at Vis, and Kabaki Karanan next to her, and you can see Sumaya, Tom Chapman and Kabaki. A lot of people who were thinking, active in the space, and producing extraordinary work. Producing work that didn't resemble work that you might see in any other architecture school. They were producing work that was exploratory, that was testing the boundaries of how we might think of architecture. And sometimes it got it wrong. Sometimes it wasn't good, sometimes it wasn't successful. But the space was created in order to make mistakes, but also to do wonderful, beautiful, fascinating, and strange things. There was a freedom that was created, a license that was generated in this space that I think was really significant. And a number of people, again, are working in this space. And that's a trajectory that's continued. That continues. You can see Simpiwe Mlambo's work from a couple of years ago. There's a tradition and a trajectory of work that's highly experimental, highly critical, that challenges norms about what an architectural project is, that enchains and integrates political narratives, social narratives, narratives that touch on issues of race, of gender, of class, ideas that are normally excluded from discussions or engagement about architecture. School became a place, and continues, I think, to be a place where those ideas can be engaged. The public programming of the school, so a really critical part of the school. What I endeavored to do when I was invited to this position was to try to keep that level of experimentation going that we've just seen examples of, and also to keep the public programming going. And the importance of that, the importance of communicating that, the importance of the value and the quality of the communication of that. The beautiful work by Fred Swart that he's done for the school sustains that, sustains the importance of how we appear, how we present ourselves in the world, how we communicate ideas and thoughts and creativity, how the practitioners that operate in the world that we find curious or interesting, who may be working at the boundaries, can be centered in this space and not marginalized. It's a very important notional idea about a school that, yes, it's a place of education, but it's also a space, particularly when it comes to architecture, for engagement, for public programming and engagement, something else that we've tried to really adhere to and continue with the school to this day, with a comprehensive program of public programs that invite not only architects, but many people who occupy creative space, who are involved with cultural production in many ways. We can learn from them, we can invite them into this space, and they can learn from us. So the school becomes a really valuable social nexus, not just a place for training, for the production of material artifacts, but a place of education, a place of reflection, a place of collective engagement, a community, a term that we use in the school, a term that I learned during my PhD from Leon van Skyke, this idea of a community of practice. We could look at a professional institute as a community of practice, but a school is also a community of practice. It's made up of people who have a common idea that's centered around education, that informs education, but constitutes in and of itself a community. Beginning to look a few years ago at the idea of building up practice-based research, building up research that's based in the diversity of practices. Most higher level research in architecture, most PhDs in architecture are actually in history, or they're in theory, which is great, but what about research that is actually based or located in practice? Should we be looking at that? We're launching at the school next year what is effectively our practice-based research PhD. Guy's been instrumental in pushing that forward through the system supported by Federico and the faculty, trying to find avenues within the school where we can advance thinking, we can build upon the thinking that operates in the diversity of the unit system, try and push thinking beyond its constraints and its professionally confined boundaries. As Frank Duffy said, most professional institutes are more concerned with the protection of their boundaries than they are with the development of their discipline. And the school plays a really important role in that. And we can facilitate, we can host events, we can allow ideas to foster. And it's the beauty of the unit system, is that idea of bringing practitioners into the space, not requiring them to adhere to a curriculum. Of course, there are outcomes and requirements, but allowing them to explore their practices in different ways. So that's the work I've tried to drive forward since I've been at the school, to try to move, looking through practices, to try and bring to the center, who are the practices, where are the practices that are operating transformatively, that are operating in different ways. Bijoy Jain's Studio Mumbai in India being a really lovely example. Bijoy Jain graduated, went back to Mumbai, and did not set up a practice. He went to the outskirts of Mumbai and rented a kind of plot of land and invited artisans, invited carpenters, invited stonemasons, invited guys who had teams of rendering walls who were struggling day to day because they didn't really have a base and were at the mercy of the contractors, gave them their own space to set up shop. And when he was commissioned to do work, would work directly with them in the design, not just using them in the construction. So the artisans, the people who were responsible for producing the building, involved in the design. A wonderful, transformative and radical practice, not something that was formulated out of theory, was formulated out of an intention and a desire to do something differently, to do something quite radically differently, and producing some really extraordinary outcomes. In the Caribbean, the work of Andres Minucci, experimenting with archetypes and forms to create, in this case, low-cost housing solutions after the earthquake in Haiti 2 years ago. That they're practitioners who seemingly, if we look at mainstream media, seem to be operating at the periphery, but actually are working at the kind of the front line of architectural production, exploring ideas that have resonance, and going back to my own dilemma, trying to work in ways in which architecture can be produced and can be engaged with resonance and with meaning and with relevance, not just sucked up into some commercialized project of capitalizations. Anna Hodges' practice in Jamaica and works with local artisans, all women. In her case, all her buildings are produced by women and built by women. That's her focus, that's her nuance. It's about empowerment. It's about addressing inequalities and asymmetries in society through her intentional work as an architect. So looking at these practitioners, looking at thinkers, bringing thinkers into the school who can bring new ideas, bring fresh ideas. Many of them not architects, many of them thinkers and practitioners dealing with ideas, as in the case of Holly, about healing, about how healing can be brought to bear. And through our practice series, inviting practitioners from a wide range of disciplines to talk about their work, how they do it. Last year we introduced students. Simpiwe and Janelle, who are both here this evening, were invited in to give a talk on their work and also participated in the exhibition that we held with the Goethe Institute. So trying to encourage and foster and cultivate those practices, giving those practices space in an environment where architecture would not normally allow that type of conversation, allowing experimentation, encouraging experimentation. And I think it's embodied in this really successful exhibition that we had. And I'm going to finish just by talking about the importance of people, the importance of this idea of community to build that. It's not about an institution, it's not about a rigid structure, it's not about a regulation of a structure, it's about a community. It's about building a sense of, building ideas, a body of ideas, encouraging freedom, encouraging people to make mistakes, encouraging people to be venturous, and to understand that to advance the work that we need to make mistakes. And we've assembled I think I'd accomplished a lot with a really extraordinary group of people over the last couple of years. It's Angelan's making team, Mark and Masejo, Unit 5 at the GSA, Natando, and Angelan, who run Unit 7, Catherine and Bonclay, bringing people together, asking young architects to experiment with ideas and thoughts that might not normally find a home, and encouraging that diversity, encourage that experimentation, encouraging that mistake making, and encouraging encouraging us to talk about it, to exchange and to reflect on it with a view to formulating new strategies and ways of producing architecture and producing it in a meaningful, resonant way that resonates with us individually, that in a relevant way that resonates with society and is human, that exists in a community and that is situated, that has a place in the world. And importantly, one which requires an infrastructure. Denise leads this team of extraordinary individuals who are not architects, but who keep us going, who keep the ship afloat and keep us in the right direction. And we all work together. We all work collectively around an idea. And it's a palpable feeling. It's not about the age of the institution. It's not about the prestige of the qualification. It's about a culture. It's about a transformative culture in which we're trying to change the ways we think about architecture. We're trying to move the way we think about architecture, to manifest the way we think about architecture, so that a generation, the next generation of architects, can work with ideas with freedom, with skill, and with confidence. So that's been the work that we've been doing. And on that note, I'll end. Thank you.